Hello and welcome to another edition of the One Drink Book Club. Today we're going to be discussing Rebel Falls, a new historical fiction that takes place during the last gasps of the Civil War. Tonight my guest is the author of Rebel Falls, Wendel. Thanks for being here, Tim.
Great, Jamie. Great to be with you and raise a glass to one drink.
My one mistake is I named it the One Drink Book Club, but I should have probably called it the Two Drink Book Club. I ask people to bring their own cocktail to it, but I stick with one. Before we start talking about the book, let me ask you, what would you have brought to the party if you were going to have a cocktail based on your book, Rebel Falls?
Well, Jamie, I would have brought a bourbon old fashioned. And granted, a tried and true cocktail right now in our day and age. But in 1864, when Rebel Falls is set, this was becoming a very hip cocktail. So much so that both the Waldorf Astoria in New York and a club in Louisville were fighting over who had discovered it first. And my protagonist, Roy Chase, partakes of one before he's just got to dive in and fight against the rebel spies one more time. But there's a little bit of my grandfather loved bourbon old fashions. And so I was able to all right, they were drinking that then. It was kind of hip. All right, cool. I'll work it in and have my protagonist abide with one and help her summon up her courage a little bit.
Well, you mentioned that, and that is exactly what I decided to make tonight.
Cheers.
Cheers. I had an Angel's Envy bourbon here.
That's good.
Yeah, I like that stuff. And, it's funny you talk about your grandfather. My grandmother had 2 Manhattans a night with old granddad bourbon. And it kept her going until I think she passed away when she was 86, 87 years old.
See, there you go. My grandfather died when he was like 92. So I'm like going, am I being told the wrong thing here half the time? Actually, the other thing I'm abiding with tonight, which is very pedestrian, but I've been fighting bad pollen and allergies down here. So I'm doing kind of tea and lemon. So, but I'm very envious of what you're raising there.
Well, I tried to do a little bit. I mean, like I said, you mentioned that your protagonist had a bourbon old fashioned. It was the only drink mentioned by name in the book.
That's right.
Which made it kind of the obvious choice. But I did do a little research. I tried to find menus from the Cataract House back in the 1800s or even the early 1900s, and I could not find any online that included drinks. I did find some of their food offerings. And I also looked at the hotel in the Sandusky as well to see
the West House.
The West House to see if they had anything. And no luck. So I did do my due diligence to see if I could unearth some interesting aspects there for a cocktail. But why don't you give a little synopsis for the listeners about what Rebel Falls is about?
Well, as you well know, Jamie, Rebel Falls is set in 1864, and I liked your terminology there, the last gasp of really the Civil War. And we have a woman spy on the Union side who's been sent to, believe it or not, the border with Canada. Why are we sending spies there? That makes no sense. But she was sent there because Confederate spies were all over the place, from Halifax all the way over to Detroit. And one reason they were there was they were trying to create an international incident, potentially to bring in England, maybe European powers, whatever. And my protagonist, a woman named Rory Chase, her assignment is to stop Confederate spies from seizing the remaining Union warship on the Great Lakes at that point. And if they had done that, I think maybe history would have been a little bit different.
Well, I was really fascinated by the story because I had no idea that there was any part of the Civil War fought at that far north, and especially that far west. And you're talking about Sandusky, Ohio, and Lake Erie. I had no idea those things were there. I had no idea that we ever had a warship on Lake Erie or in the Great Lakes. So that was an interesting angle.
Right, and it was quite a warship too. It was iron hulled. It was roughly 165 feet. It had great weaponry. And so if the Confederate spies had gotten a hold of it, their plan, and they come within a whisker of it, is without revealing too much, they plan to bombard Toledo, Cleveland, Buffalo, probably Erie too, throw that in, on the eve of the presidential election. And why is that a big deal? Well, we've got war fatigue in the North. We've been fighting this war for 4 years. And even within Lincoln's cabinet, Abraham Lincoln's White House, the upcoming 1864 election was perceived to be very close. I mean, you look at the history books now and it's a landslide for Lincoln. But if the rebel spies had gotten a hold of the Michigan, the USS Michigan, the name of the warship, maybe that tilts the balance right at a very pivotal time in our nation's history.
Oh yeah. Now, what got you interested in this story and in this part of the Civil War? I know that your grandfather grew up in Niagara Falls. I read that. But what kind of brought you to this story and convinced you that this was a story needing telling?
Well, I guess a couple of things, Jamie. First of all, as you say, there's a family connection there. I grew up also 15 miles away from Niagara Falls. I've always been enthralled with Niagara Falls, even though it gets kind of ticky tack now and such. I mean, the difference between both sides of the border is just mind boggling. The U.S. side needs a real economic boost, and then you go across to the Canadian side, and it's becoming like Las Vegas on the Niagara River. But I've always been enthralled with Niagara Falls, and I was reading a couple books, notably Team of Rivals by Doris Kearns Goodwin, uh, Carl Sandburg's Lincoln, and both of them mention, and just mention, it's kind of an aside, these rebel spies. One's named John Yates Bell, real life guy, and another guy named Bennett Burleigh, who was a soldier of fortune from Scotland. And one reason, say, Goodwin mentions them is Lincoln did not pardon John Yates Bell. He pardoned seemingly everybody else, but he didn't pardon him. And so, as a result, that ticks off a lot of people. One of them being John Wilkes Booth, and you start going, what's going on up on the border? And you realize that it's funny. We tend to have, I think, this perception of Canada as being so innocent. The longest unguarded border and all this type of stuff. And I can say these things. I'm married a Canadian, so it's okay. But but during the Civil War, it's where a lot of spy espionage and money was being fostered. Richmond would send up money through people like John Wilkes Booth and would kind of get filtered down through. One of the best descriptions I heard of, say, Montreal was it was a lot like Casablanca, and everybody kind of went to these particular bars like they did, like going to Rick's in Casablanca. And it's funny because I think sometimes we tend to think of Canada as where escaped slaves, freedom seekers were trying to get to, and certainly that's true. But you also had this other side where at least part of the churches, a lot of the businesses were, in a sense, backing the South. And that kind of comes out in various odd ways when John Wilkes Booth is pulled out of that farmhouse in Port Royal after escaping the authorities for 12 days after assassinating Lincoln. They're emptying his pockets. And it's kind of the typical stuff. Oh, they've got some coins, and here's a pocket knife and whatever. Oh, hang on. Here's a banknote from a bank in Montreal. And in a sense, that's where he had been funded through. The money was being kind of filtered through that way.
Yeah, it was really interesting, and you touch on it a little bit. Um, the Some of the characters that are in Rebel Falls that play a part in spying for the Union, or at least counteracting the spies from the Confederacy, are also involved in the Underground Railroad and the employees of the Cataract House being some of those. And it really was interesting to see how Niagara Falls was kind of the last stop on the Underground Railroad. And that final journey was really perilous because you had to go over the river, and you either did it in a rowboat or you did it on the suspension bridge. And there were people, as you said, that were sympathetic to the South who would camp out at the entrance of the bridge to try to discover anybody hidden in a wagon or trying to get over to freedom. And so I thought that was a really interesting aspect of the story. And I often you hear about the Underground Railroad, but I didn't realize how it funneled people to Niagara.
Yeah, it was like one of the last major stops or jumping off points, which you just talked about, Jamie, because you could literally see freedom on the other side of the Niagara River, and yet it was very difficult to get there. It was, treacherous either way. And as you mentioned, the guys who would camp out near the suspension bridge, which was a very eerie kind of construction. The railroad was on the top, and underneath was this kind of portal where the carriages would go through. It looked like something Dante would do with the Inferno or something. And you had these guys hanging around, and they were simply called the bystanders. You weren't quite sure if they were going to blow the whistle on some kind of escape attempt or not. And people were going, bystanders, why would they have been there? Well, with the fugitive slave law, you could have, benefited or gotten part of the reward for returning, in a sense, a slave back to his or her owner in the South.
Sure.
And the other one was to simply get across the Niagara River, which at that point is whirlpools and currents because it's right after, in a sense, the falls, literally, right there by the precipice. And they had 209 steps, a wooden staircase that, in a sense, the people working at the Cataract House maintained, and there was always a rowboat there waiting, often with somebody who was very accomplished oarsman to row you across and get you over to Canada.
Now, one of the questions I had, you mentioned that the staff of the Cataract House often were either escaped or freed slaves, and they helped slaves get across that had come up maybe through the Underground Railroad, but also slaves that were vacationing with their masters or the people who owned them, and the staff would kind of get them when they were alone for a moment and say, "Hey, look, if you want to get across to Canada, we'll do it right now." And
Very
so,
much.
which I thought was interesting, and I also thought, boy, why would anybody who was traveling with slaves come to stay at the Cataract House? Wouldn't that get out there?
I think and this is all based on fact too. I mean, Rebel Falls is a novel, but it's so, so much research went into it. Everything we're talking about here in terms of escape and the Cataract House is all legit. It's all based on fact. But I think in some ways it kind of shows how, um, first of all, the Cataract House was one of the luxury hotels in the world, pretty much. I mean, Charles Dickens stays there. Lincoln stays there at one point. Henry Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. The list goes on and on. And the food was great. You looked up the menu, and the ambiance was beautiful. I mean, the hotel existed till 1945. And so I guess folks just couldn't stay away. And the other thing they couldn't do too was, oh, hang on, we're going on vacation. Well, I guess we need some help. So we can't leave everybody back on the plantation. And so they would do this time and time again. And word certainly got out. Hey, there's something amiss or a hubbub at the Cataract House. But in a sense, they would still bring, in a sense, some of their slaves with them. And I think you touched on something that's really kind of interesting, Jamie, because the Cataract House staff, especially the wait staff and the dining room, was very well coordinated, but it was all pretty much freed or escaped slaves, pretty much all African Americans. And they would come to a slave with a Southern plantation family or whatever, and they would say, "Do you want freedom? Do you want to get away?" And you had to decide like that. It wasn't like, well, let me think it over a little bit and get back to me tomorrow. It was like, no, either we go or we don't go. And I think that's an amazing deal. And doing the research for Rebel Falls, I came across actual ledgers that were kept at the Cataract House through the Underground Railroad, and it's just and each escapee or ones that make it to freedom, or actually every incident, some didn't, is recorded there. And it's like hundreds of them. And it's like the name and how they got away and how quickly it was done and if they were pursued and etc. And you're just looking at this going, yeah, I could have some fun with
Well,
this.
that's amazing. Well, it's interesting. You've written both fiction and nonfiction. When you started researching this, was there a question in your mind? Was this going to be a nonfiction, perhaps, or a fiction? When did you make that decision?
Um, I made it after doing a fair amount of research. Um, Jamie, you're right. It started nonfiction at first, because fiction's a little bit more of a leap of faith. But and I certainly was doing research on John Yates Bell and Bennett Burleigh, the kind of the main Confederate spies in this incident. But I kept going, I need something a little bit more, on the Union side. And there was certainly spies or couriers and espionage against them. But at that point, I went, let's see how deep we can go with this. And it's at that point I decided I'd like a woman protagonist, in part because she wants to become involved with the war effort, but that's difficult for a woman to do.
Sure.
Whereas if you're a guy or in the Civil War, oh, I'd like to fight. Oh, yeah, okay, you're right down there, and you're probably dead in 2 weeks.
Sure. Sure.
So I started playing that out, and then I went, let's take it another step further. Because in my mind, the most powerful family, or one of them, at this point in time in our nation's history, is the Seward family out of Auburn, New York, who's the Secretary of State. William Seward is for Lincoln. They're become, bosom buddies. They work hand in glove. And probably a lot of people remember Seward as the guy who buys Alaska from the Russians,
A very smart guy.
A very smart guy, even though it was called Seward's Folly at that point.
Exactly.
But I'm going, it'd be great to get like inside that household somewhat and get close up to this guy who's making a lot of powerful decisions. So at that point, I decided my major protagonist, Rory Chase, a woman, kind of a tomboy, very much wants to be involved in the Union effort. But what if she's been the childhood friend of Fanny Seward, the only daughter of the Secretary of State? So then it allowed me to kind of get us inside Washington intrigue. It allows me to kind of, almost instantaneously, oh, Rory, you want to be involved in the war effort? Oh, Secretary Seward's going to send you to the, Canadian border. And then all of a sudden things started to take off. And at that point you go, if it's rolling like this, we got to raise a glass and go for it.
Well, I think you made the right decision, because I really liked Rory Chase as a character, and it also allows you to put in dialogue. And obviously, Bell and Burleigh were real people. Seward was a real person, but you can, take some artistic license and put in dialogue that makes the story go fast. I mean, I read this very quickly because it was interesting, engaging. It read like a novel, because it is a novel, but it certainly had all the key incidents in it were real. And so that was, to me as a reader, I really enjoyed that. Do you find it easier to write nonfiction or fiction?
And really, I don't know. I'm going to gauge this a little bit. I really do need a stiff drink. It really kind of depends on the story a little bit, and if, I had the setting soon with Niagara Falls, and I love it so much. And as soon as I started hearing about the Cataract House, and anybody who's up there, I would urge them to go to the Underground Railroad Heritage Center, which is a great museum. And it has like a little, you can walk through kind of a facsimile of the suspension bridge. It's got a lot about the Cataract House. It's really well done. And so I hit upon that and I go, okay, I got a place. Now, can I get characters here that will, in a sense, work in this setting? And one of the things I do, whether I'm writing nonfiction or fiction, Jamie, is I'll talk with my characters. Okay, that makes sense. With nonfiction, you interview somebody, oh, that's a little murky. Okay, I'll go back to them, potentially tell me some more about this, whatever. I'll kind of do the same thing with my fictional characters. And that sounds kind of strange. People are going, what do you mean you talk to them? I kind of do. And it's a great way to be left alone to write. And okay, what's your motivation there? Why are you doing this? And it's important to me, all the characters we've been kind of mentioning, John Yates Bell, Bennett Burleigh, Rory, I needed to know at specific times what they were afraid of and what they were trying to do, what their motivation was. And once that starts to click, I'm going, all right, let's just see where this goes. And it took me, especially with fiction, a long time to figure out. I used to outline more, and I still outline some. But when the characters start taking it away from the outline, I used to get really mad. How dare you do this? I'm writing this story, you jokers. But now I go, okay, I wish you'd take this over because I'm making a mess out of it. And they often will start to take it, no, we're going to go this way. Oh, why? And then they'll tell you.
Oh, interesting. I mean, I find that process really fascinating. And one of the things I liked about your characters in this book is that they were not black and white. They did not do. They certainly did things where they were motivated by various things in their past or their passions or their beliefs, but they didn't always do what you thought they might do. In
Yeah.
Rory Chase, especially, there's some situations where she could um, let somebody go free or let somebody, or capture somebody, or she could advocate for them in one way or another. And it didn't always go like you thought it would go. And the same thing with the other characters. It was nice, even the villains in this, John Yates Bell and Burley, were complex characters. They weren't just, oh, that's the bad guy. And
Mm-hmm.
now they have, they're twisting their mustache and doing evil things. I mean, they had you didn't dislike them because they were definitely motivated by their own beliefs. And they also had their own kind of moral compass in one way or another. And so I thought that was kind of interesting, and it made it more enjoyable and a little bit more thought provoking to know that they weren't just this kind of cartoon character people.
Yeah. Well, thank you for saying that because I think in some ways, if characters are going to work, especially in a novel, but even in nonfiction, we're often contradictions. We maybe start one way, something stymies. If we go another way, we kind of self correct. And as you say, our moral compass takes us back this way. There's some incidents, as you well know, when Rory infiltrates kind of the rebel cell or whatever, the group, and she's coming in very determined. I mean, she's very much pro-union, and we always kind of know that. But she at times gets so caught up in the rhetoric of the South and they will rise again and all this type of stuff that even for a time she loses her way, which I think is very realistic. I mean, you get around larger than life people sometimes, and your mind may be saying, well, this is nuts. I mean, we got to go over here. But in a sense, you get swept along. And all of them, in some ways, at certain moments, get swept up either by the company they're keeping or the surroundings and the circumstances. And I think that's very human in a way. I know I do all the time. I get swept up by too many things.
um, we talked about that you chose a heroine and not a hero. What went into that? What was your motivation to do that? And was it harder for you to write for a woman? Obviously, being that you're a man, like what went into that decision?
Well, a little bit, Jamie, as well. We were talking about before. We kind of forget what the casualties and how horrific the Civil War was. And so, pretty much the first obstacle Rory Chase meets is she wants to be involved in some way with the war effort. She wants to do good, and she doesn't want to, sit at home and, I don't know, knit socks or something for the guys on the front lines. And so, this is kind of already pushes her out of her comfort zone. And and at that point, I was thinking, I've almost got to write this maybe from a woman's point of view because if it was a guy, it'd be so easy. Yeah, go enlist. Okay, go ahead. I mean, they were just churning through guys on both sides. And at that point, I started to go, did this really happen? I know we had women spies, but for a little bit, Rory even, you know, disguises herself as a man. and is in the Union Army in a regiment. And I kept going, did this happen? And then you find out that there were women on both sides of the conflict who went in disguise. One of the most memorable ones was a woman named Sarah Edmonds out of Michigan with the 2nd Infantry out of there. Fought, was kind of a mail carrier, went between lines for almost 3 years, and then deserted, pretty much because mentally she was shot. And we realize now she was suffering from PTSD. They didn't know about that back then. And then years later, decided I'm having some economic problems, some financial problems. It'd be really good if I had my pension,
Oh, sure.
my service pension. And she actually went to court, revealed herself to her former, regiment folks that she had been a woman, and she got her pension. And I went at that point. I went, all right, there's a very determined woman. And I think in some ways there was two windows here that I felt the Civil War ignores. One's the role of women, whether it's Belle Boyd or, somebody like Sarah Edmonds or whatever. And the other one was just kind of this role or this other front being in the border, and how this was, in a sense, waiting. It was like a tinderbox waiting for something to happen. And England and the European powers are watching this. And if something like rebel spies seizing a warship or something, it becomes the thing that ignites it. And some people have said, Amanda Foreman wrote a great book called A World on Fire about this time period. And it pretty much, the point is, this is almost the beginning of the First World War, because you have all these other countries kind of watching our huge war. They're seeing how many people are being killed. They're seeing the weaponry being used, and they're going, should we get in on one side or the other? Should we be a power broker here? And all they were waiting for was maybe one incident which would give them an excuse to come in.
Sure. Which is really interesting, and I suppose lucky that it didn't happen, because it would have just extended the bloodshed and everything else. Uh, there were a couple other characters that were prominent in the book. There is a woman who lives in Niagara Falls who is kind of a spy who is also worked very closely on the Underground Railroad with Mr. Douglas at the Cataract House. And in their exchanges, Mr. Douglas would send her, he was African American, Reet was not, and he would send her these poems. And you kind of allude to almost, a romantic interest between the two of them. They're clearly old friends. But I mean, was I imagining that, or was that something you were clearly trying to portray?
No, you picked up on it. And it's funny because I love the Reek character, and in part because she runs this photography store, or what it's called, sometimes called in that era, a likeness store. And in a sense, we suddenly had the ability to do photographs, tintypes, whatever they might have been. And everybody now going off to the front, who signed up for the war, last thing they do would probably go down the REIT store and get an image made that they could kind of give to their family. And it's very similar in some ways to what's going on now with us, maybe with AI or streaming video or things like that. This was like the technology change. And a lot of people, Lincoln, for example, I think one reason Lincoln gets elected as president is he gives that famous speech in New York City, I believe, a house divided cannot stand, etc. And then he went down to Matthew Brady's likeness or photography store and had that picture made of him. And that becomes then the one that's bandied all around before the Republican convention. I mean, he was very savvy about going, this is a new technology. This will take a guy who's just unknown from Illinois or whatever and put him front and center. And it certainly did. So it's interesting how we can look back at certain times and we tend to think, oh, photography, who cares? But at that point, it was cutting edge because it was also bringing in images from the battle zone to people's living room. Very similar in some ways, maybe to what we saw on our television sets during Vietnam. Suddenly the war was there.
Absolutely. And I think photography has played a big part in our perceptions of any war. And I think, especially you're right with Vietnam, if you say think about the images you remember from Vietnam, I think most people are gonna the assassination of
Sure.
that young man, or the poor woman running from the napalm, who was a 12-year-old girl at the time. And so it is really interesting, and it's kind of that beginning. I mean, television made a massive change in how we perceived politicians. I don't think Franklin Roosevelt would have been able to be elected had television been
Yeah.
at the time, a prominent medium at the time. In Kennedy, it really helped Kennedy against Nixon. So I think it's interesting that you did that. And Rory, your main character, was an artist, and part of her
Hmm.
value in this whole escapade for the spies was that she could draw things, and they wanted to use it as propaganda. So I think Reed's character was good, and I liked the play of the forbidden love kind of interest there. There was a nice addition. There was, so one of the things I did, and I kind of get into this, is I looked up photos of the USS Michigan, and I looked up
Oh,
photos of the Cataract House, and all of those things. It's really fun for me to look at that, and I would encourage anybody who reads Rebel Falls to kind of do the same, because those things really did exist. And it's neat to see those images of those things. And another thing you mentioned, one of the things I like about living in Washington is there's so much history here.
mhm.
And you mentioned that there was kind of an offhand comment that poet Walt Whitman would hang out at the corner of L and Vermont, and Lincoln would often pass by in his, at the time, motorcade, but it wasn't a motorcade, it was just him in a wagon, and he would nod at him, and they would kind of acknowledge each other. And what struck me is, I mean, you put that specific cross street in the book, and my office was at L in Vermont for 15 years. We just moved about a year and a half ago. And so I thought to myself, all those times I have walked by that corner, thousands of times really, and I never knew that it had this place in history, that I was standing where Walt Whitman would stand and watch Lincoln go by. So I thought that was really cool.
Oh, that's nice. And as we're talking about, that's legit. I mean, Whitman did that time after time. There's a great book, I think it's just called Whitman and Lincoln or something, that I read in the course of doing this. And, and it's a little tragic because they both knew of each other and they both
Right.
really respected each other. And I believe it was in that book or maybe some other research I was doing where Whitman was somewhat backed financially by John Hay, one of Lincoln's secretaries, and they would try to help him out and this type of thing. And Whitman, now a couple of weeks before the assassination in 1864, actually they said, "Come to the White House. We're trying to help you out on this." And Lincoln was there, and they kind of were in the same room, but they didn't talk. They weren't introduced, and Whitman didn't want to intrude or whatever. And you look at, say, some of Whitman's papers and such later, it was an opportunity lost in a way because then too soon Lincoln was taken from us. So, but I love those things where major individuals in different fields will kind of recognize, maybe the greatness or the good work being done by somebody else over here. And that's certainly the case with those two individuals.
Absolutely. And I will say that part of the reason he would nod at him is that he didn't have a motorcade. Because when I first moved to Washington about 28 years ago, the first motorcade that stopped me on my commute home, I thought, this is really cool. The president's right in front of me. And then everyone after that, I was annoyed and would shake my fist at them saying, you've got a helicopter, use it. Where are you going at 6 o'clock that you need to snarl traffic in downtown
That's
DC?
right. Why are you keeping me from getting home?
Come
I
on,
hear you.
man.
As one who used to live in DC too, I feel your pain.
Yes. Well, we recently moved our office to Roslyn, which is just across the river
Oh,
in Virginia,
yeah.
and I have to say the commute is much better.
I know Roslyn. I used to work at USA Today on that
Oh,
USA Today
sure.
building.
Right
Right.
across the street from where I work now.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Quite the place.
yeah. So, well, tell me what projects are you working on now? What's next for you?
Oh, we're kind of throwing some things against the wall a little bit, Jamie, but I I liked hanging at this time period along the Niagara River, and and a lot of people don't maybe haven't heard of this group, but called the Fenians, and they invaded. They were kind of leftover. How could I say? They were veterans of the Civil War, mostly on the
Okay,
Union side, and they were mostly Irish American. And for a time, a very short time, they invaded Canada. And you're going, why'd they invade Canada? Why would they do
interesting.
that? And they were so desperate to get help, for Ireland at that point, which was under
Yeah.
lock and key by Great Britain. And it's a very bizarre plan, but it had some merit and was working for a little bit. Their idea was, let's seize parts of Canada and we'll exchange them for parts of Ireland. And they were a fighting machine because they had made it through the Civil War, many of them using the same weapons, the rifles and such they had used. So I began to play around with that a little bit, and it allows me to keep, characters like Reet, maybe even Rory, certainly Mr. Douglas, the Cataract House Hotel still going to town. So we'll see. We'll see where this goes.
Oh, good, good. Well, I know you're doing some things to promote the book. Where can people find out about where you're going to be to do readings? Where can they buy the book? Um,
Yeah, well, certainly maybe the best place to go is my website, just timwendel.com. And you'll see on the front page, it kind of extends down a little bit where I'm going to be over the next, 4, 6, 8 weeks. And it is jumping around a bit. We just signed up a gig at the Seward House, believe it or not, in
oh,
Auburn, New
cool,
York. So that'll
nice.
be fun. And, the book can be found pretty much anywhere. And if you've got, the wherewithal or whatever, I would urge you to go to your independent bookstore. I may just order it through there. Hopefully they have it already, but the independents always need some help. So you can find it, and also too, Jamie, I would say anybody who's got more questions or whatever they want to know, what was he talking about? You can always reach me through the website too, and there's a contact button on there, and I'm happy to hear from you.
Well, I noticed that you're going to be at Politics and Prose in DC on May 19th. So if I can make it by, I will come by and say
Oh,
hello in
please come
person.
by. Yeah, and
Um,
I'll be in conversation with Ethelbert Miller, who's a force of nature. I'm not quite sure what Ethelbert's got up his sleeve. This is a wild combination of stuff. He's a poet. He taught at Howard. I believe he ran for mayor of D.C. at one point, and he also was a Grammy Award nominee for the spoken word. So I'm
Triple
just a
threat.
gog at the guy. Yeah, quadruple, whatever. I'm part of me is going, I'm not sure what I've gotten myself into, but if people want to see, yeah, come on down to Politics and Prose on May 19th, Sunday, May 19th at 3 p.m. And you can see what Ethelbert's got up his sleeve for me.
Well, Tim, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about the book. I really enjoyed it. If you go out, definitely check out Rebel Falls. And if you are listening to the podcast, I suggest subscribing either on Apple, YouTube, or whatever platform you listen to your podcast. And thanks again, Tim.
My pleasure, Jamie. And yes, folks, subscribe. This is a great show.